All right. All right. Hello and blessings. Blessings to each of you. Welcome to the Calvinist Boo Crew. I'm your host, J.C. Bear. What a joy to start this new discussion session with each one of you. And friends, we're just going to drop right into good discussions with dear panel members, because this episode is part 2 of a recent series that we started, taking a look at an interesting text by Paul Copan called "Is God a Vindictive Bully?" And in part 1, we had such a great time talking about the setup for Copan's text that we did not get into the text. Thus, in some sense, I think viewers who were expecting that were probably disappointed, but we did have a lot of fun talking, and it was good setup. But I'm here with good friends today, and we're going to get into the text, and we're going to talk more about what's at stake when we think about this question: is God a bully? Joining me are some amazing panel members, top people, and let me introduce them to you and ask them to say hello and a few words, and we'll get right into it. Benjamin, we had part 1. It was really a lot of fun, but it's really a setup for what is a longer, lengthier discussion. How do you feel about this kind of topic in that way?
Oh, I think it's a fantastic topic. I think it's a fantastic topic to get into. I think a lot of people have this lurking in the back of their consciousness, thinking that, God is just this savage, barbarian warlord in the sky. And I think that this is a great thing to address. Back to you.
Joshua, one of the things that we mentioned in the last episode was not that there were never any of these accusations in the history past, but that so much of the intensity of these accusations is a recent phenomenon. What is that like for you, and how often are you hitting these kinds of issues when you're talking with people? And what are the kinds of things that you want to say when you're first talking with someone and they present you with a strong thesis? Joshua, your God is a moral monster.
Well, to be fair, I think that a lot of that comes from more, like you said, more modern philosophies, more modern ways of thinking, where people end up seeing themselves as a good moral compass, and they believe, and I think rather falsely, but they believe that somehow humans can differentiate between right and wrong on such a level that they then get to judge God, if that makes sense. And I think the best way that I can describe how I might approach that with a person would be to simply say, in all the accusations that they may have, if they actually investigate those accusations further and they actually delve into the reasons why, say, something has happened, depending on what they're talking about, because that's the other thing. They may be talking about whether it's something in the Bible, or they may be talking about things that happen in day-to-day life, or they may be talking about the fact that we'll be judged eventually, and that certain individuals unfortunately will not make it into heaven. So I think ultimately the best way to approach that is to, one, demonstrate to them that humans are not the paragon of morality and ethics, although they can recognize them. They are not the final authority. And two, that God is wiser than we are and understands things better than we do. And if we investigate all of those claims, I don't think any of them hold up to scrutiny.
Joshua, that's a beautiful opening statement. And I promised at the beginning of the last discussion that we would get into the Copan text, but first we needed some backstory. At the risk of a repeat, we're going to get into the Copan text, but first we need a little bit of backstory. Now, we talked last time, and here's my major thesis for us to talk about as a group. When I survey the landscape of people having these kinds of discussions today, is God a moral monster? Is God a vindictive bully? Can we put God on trial? One of the things that has come to my mind is that there are these three broad major categories of groups of people. And we called them the reds, the light blues, and the dark blues, roughly corresponding to conservative and traditional monergistic forms of Christianity for the reds, modern liberalized synergistic forms of Christianity and theism for the blue. And then, you know, the dark blue is for folks who are definitely outside of that circle, looking in as an external critic. And so to cut to the chase, I think that three different juries from each of these groups of people would very likely return different verdicts. And that's going to be important when we're taking a look at how Copan talks in his work here. And so just breaking that out at a high level, the first group I want to talk about is the folks in the dark blue group. And it's not that Isaac Asimov or Richard Dawkins or Friedrich Nietzsche are the leaders of any group. It's just that they're great examples of the kinds of people who are likely to say these kinds of talking points that I hear very often in the "Is God a moral monster" discussions. And so we've got that famous statement, epitomizing statement from Friedrich Nietzsche, which we've talked about in the last episode. God is dead and we have killed him. Now there's more to that statement, and there's some subtlety and some nuance, but it's definitely a post-biblical and in most cases a post-Christian criticism. Some of the things that I know I'll hear from people in this group might sound something like reading the Bible is the easiest way to make someone an atheist. And the idea here is that in the evaluation of the people in this dark blue group, there's something fundamentally unacceptable to them about the God of the Bible as he's presented. You'll often hear as well people talking about the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. And there will be a presupposition that in some sense, these problems are insurmountable for a theistic thesis. So in other words, when Christians like us are talking with non-Christians like them, people in the dark blue have a familiarity and a comfort level with sort of folding their arms. I think you've got some real difficult problems to try to overcome, Mr. Christian. And what do they propose instead? Well, you start to see in their ethics, you start to see in their statements and manifestos and creeds, you see these ideas of humanism. You see this idea of human flourishing. You see the turn to the subject. And then in my own analysis of the people in the dark blue, you also see an interesting phenomenon that I call the Diogenization of critical methods. And another way to call that might be a cosmopolitanism. And what's the basic idea here? Well, the basic idea is, I don't know if anybody else has noticed, but you talk with some of these strident critics, and let's just say there's a little bit of abrasiveness to some of their objections. Not only are there some walls that we Christians have to surmount in their minds, but the folks in the dark blue quite feel that there's some sort of grudge here. There's some sort of grievance the people in the dark blue have against some of the traditional conservative conceptions. And that's going to come out and manifest in some important ways. So we're going to go through the other two groups real quick, but Benjamin, I just wanted to check in with you. Are you encountering folks in this blue camp very often? And if so, A, what's it like to talk with them? And then B, how do you approach starting to get into these edifying situations where you can even have a discussion that might go somewhere?
Gosh, JC, I you know, honestly think that when I talk to these people, I like to just get them to just talk and just let me listen, because I find it's a waste of time to try to attack their position, because usually their position is so weird. Like, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that it's like it's not predictable. There's a lot of different positions that they can take in the blue. I mean, I hear people come up with all kinds of arguments, and the thing is that usually there's like a certain feature or facet of their argument that is the core of it. So I like to listen to them explain their view and find that like laser point core, you know, and then hit that.
Great point. Great point. Joshua, there's perhaps no one right way to always engage, but do you find that people in this camp, do you find any patterns that are helpful to you when you're talking with folks?
Well, it definitely depends on the person. I think Benjamin has the right idea that for an individual, you really have to listen to their particular claim or their particular position, really, to understand exactly what's going on with it. Some people don't even fall into this blue category in the non-believer side. Some of them fall in this category where they wouldn't even agree with, you know, rules of logic or even principles. So then you have to find a different way to deal with them. But in this particular way, a lot of these individuals at least fancy themselves using logic and rationality. So you can find that if that works for them, it might be best to really engage with them on that level. So like something, for example, like the problem of evil and them saying that suffering and evil both are somehow insurmountable. It would be very interesting. I would have to sit there and say, well, can you provide any kind of positive proof of that claim? And I think that ultimately they'll, you know, like I've looked at arguments for it, but everything that I've seen is that kind of a claim is itself insurmountable. It's such a heavy burden of proof to bear to suggest that, you know, God could have no sufficient reason whatsoever to allow, you know, evil or suffering. And in fact, it's worse than that, I would say, because on their view, evil and suffering are meaningless. I mean, suffering would exist, but evil itself wouldn't exist. It would be like, what are you talking about, evil? You're sneaking in terms that if you assume that God doesn't exist and there's no objective moral law, then there can't be such a thing as evil. So it's really defeating itself. And I think that a person who at least purports that claim, if you approached it in that kind of a way and started to say, okay, does that argument really stand? Does it really have the weight that they say? It might be effective for them, at least, to hear that, and then they may start to question their own assumption.
Great point, my friend. Great point. Well said. And I think maybe the second group for us to take a look at. So before we go to the second group, my take on people in the dark blue is that in general, for most of the typical situations, when I interact with people in the dark blue group, they vote to convict. So yes, God is a vindictive bully, as you traditional conservative Christians present him, as you talk about him in the Bible, in the scriptures, as you offer him in your religious practices. So I think that a jury made up of people from this category are typically going to convict. Now, maybe over in an opposing situation would be something close to where we might be, and this is a more conservative, more traditional Christian orthodoxy, and some of the ideas that will come out. Well, is God a moral monster? Is God a vindictive bully? If you ask traditional-minded Christians, I think you'll hear the kinds of things like, well, it doesn't make sense for the creature to put the Creator on trial. How could we even have a legitimate court proceeding? And so you'll hear from people these ideas that God is ex lex. And the idea from that meaning that God is outside of the categories that would make such a trial even possible. Now, also the traditional Christians will talk about the God of the Bible, or what is said here, the textual God. You know, the God of the Bible, as revealed by the text, is the actual God. And that's going to have some real interesting implications in interactions with the other two groups. Another important distinction I've seen is people in the red category are very likely to answer questions about the problems of evil and suffering. Not necessarily dismissively, but with answers something along the lines of, well, perhaps God has his reasons. And then we are thrown into this idea of what even is the role of criticism in hierarchies. So critical thinking, critical theories, when we put on our hats and think critically, what are we doing? Does it even make sense for a creature to put on the judge's uniform and sit in a court setting and suppose that he's in a position to competently evaluate the Creator? God is free. You know, we're going to contrast this with our dear friends in the light blue category in just a moment. But there's a lot of talk about the freedom of the human subject amongst folks in the light blue. But the freedom is mostly, amongst conservatives, mostly ascribed to God. God is the ultimate free being, and the creature is in the position of having a duty to respond. And so that affects this question. Is God a moral monster? Is God a vindictive bully? Well, is it wrong for generals to give orders to soldiers that will cause casualties in war? That sort of hierarchical question will come up. And then finally, with respect to the dear friends in the light blue, conservative Christianity is something that I jokingly call Christianity 1.0. It's the old Christianity. It's the pre-modern orthodoxy, and it's typically contrasted with a modern Christianity of the more recent secular Enlightenment liberals and post-Kantian order, let's put it that way. And then finally, who is this Savior, this Jesus Christ? He is the royal person. And when God comes into my home, do I arrest him and take him down to the courthouse and put him on trial? Or do I go over to the crown that is locked away in the chambers of my heart, take it out of there and place it upon his head in a reverent fashion and bow before him. So I think these are some of the features that we're going to see. Now, before we get to the middle, the light blue, Benjamin, are these some of these talking points fair talking points for conservatism? Do you recognize some of your own thinking in some of these points? And, how do you see the engagement happening in the culture with people who have these kinds of points?
Well, I think these are really interesting points. I guess for me, one of the big things that I see in the liberal Christianity versus conservative Christianity is a denigration of the scriptures in liberal Christianity, sort of a reduction of the scriptures from exegesis to eisegesis, and for the more casual person not associated with those terms, from reading what the text says, the liberal Christian goes to reading into the text what they want to be there. And they know they're doing it. It's not like, oh, I think they're doing it. It's like they'll tell you they're doing it. They're like, these texts are just a guideline for us to like understand ourselves better and things like that. And another thing that I've noticed with liberal Christianity is a real disacknowledgement of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. Is it's kind of treated as insignificant, or just sort of a if it happens, it happens sort of thing. These are really interesting points here. These are not my mental list of things that I thought conservative Christianity, but I'm definitely open to this. I do agree that God is, he is the authority above law itself. I mean, I think that he is the law ultimately himself, you know. Obviously not the law of Moses, but I think that the law of Moses was a codification of the personality of God on moral matters. And I think that when you say the textual God is the actual God, do you mean that the God is exegetically? Is that what you're saying? That like, God is what the Bible says he is, not what we want to read into the Bible. Is that what you're
Right,
saying there?
right, exactly.
Okay.
And by the way, this textual God versus the actual God is going to be one of the main points from the section of Copan's book that we talk about further. So just to give folks a heads up, we're going to talk more about this distinction in just a few moments.
Okay. And let's see. I don't quite understand about the role of criticism and hierarchy, but I do believe God has his reasons in the problem of evil. This is interesting. God is free. The creature has a duty to respond. This is interesting. I'd be interested in hearing more articulation on that. I'd be curious to hear more articulation on Jesus being the royal person.
Great points. We will. And especially in the next slide when we compare with the folks in the light blue, who I will call the modern Christians, for lack of a better designation. But Joshua, how about yourself? How close might this look to you? How are there some important ways it's different? And what's it like to see these kinds of positions offered in the culture today?
Well, I would say that on many of these, that I'm inclined to agree with them. Things like the textual God is the actual God. I agree. The problem, evil, and suffering. God has his reasons. I agree. What is the role of criticism in hierarchies? And I presume that is the questioning of authority. And that I do believe that God has his authority to do as he so pleases. The creature has a duty to respond to God's moving of his heart. I believe all of those things. I am curious, and I know, as you said, you'll get more into Jesus Christ being the royal person, and then Christianity 1.0 versus modern Christianity. But I think that a lot of these things, honestly, it's funny because there's always this these memes, you know, where it shows like low IQ, and then it's like a bell curve and has like the middle IQ, and then it has like on the other side like the high IQ, and the low IQ and the high IQ really agree. And not to call people, not to insult anybody, that's not the point of that, but I really find that I think people who are at the beginning of their Christian walk, they'll see these kind of points and they'll think, oh yes, these are the right points. Excuse me. And then a lot of people who are like, you know, more in the middle of it, they're like, they learn to question certain things, and so then a lot of things become blurred. But then once they finally really process it and understand all the stuff, they would then come to affirm a lot of these points. I think that the modern world has a lot of questions when it comes to a lot of things, and one of the benefits that we have that our ancestors didn't have is that we have access to things like the internet, and, you know, an abundance of books and a lot of intermixing of culture that, you know, a lot of people didn't have prior to. We also have it a lot better, you know, just from you know, we have more food, we have more leisure time, we have a lot more what's the word we're looking for, not even, I guess, like free time. Things are just better that we can sit down and have these discussions and talk about these things, whereas back in the day, you know, you're trying to put food on the table, you didn't really have time to ponder a lot of philosophical or higher thinking. You really needed to get done what you needed to get done. So I think that ultimately that's where it would come from a modern perspective, is that people are open to the questions, and they understand how to question it now. They have time to question it. But I think if they really explore the topics, that they'll find a lot of these points. I think they would end up agreeing, but they would have to really do a deep dive, I think.
Right. Yeah. Great answer. And where I would suppose that a jury of people from the dark blue group would vote to convict, yes, God is a moral monster. Yes, God is a vindictive bully. My intuition here is that probably a jury of members from this red group would, in some sense, probably not even participate in the trial. They would say something to the effect of, you know, this is a categorical error. You don't put God on trial. It's a mistake to even think that that's the right way to go or place to go. Now, that's going to, and by the way, I just want to point out, Augustine, Bavinck, and Machen, again, they're just some great examples from this group, but by no means are they the only set of folks here, and nor are they perfect representatives. But I think you'll find it's fair, and part of the reason why I bring that up is when we go here to the middle portion, the light blue, which we're ready to do now. These are going to be your modern Christians, people who stand on the shoulders of the modern secularized Enlightenment for good, or perhaps not always for good. And one of the reasons why I mention the exemplars is we have Erasmus here and William Lane Craig, two fine examples of people from this stream, in my opinion. By no means the only. And when I was constructing this, I didn't mean to make this imply that this is a movement that is being championed by Erasmusites today, or even that William Lane Craig himself, that this is the main thrust of his ministry, but rather more that Craig and Copan are very close-minded with respect to this and the way they want to investigate this. And so what are some of the differences? Well, if the people in the red group might think that it's not even correct to put God on trial, I think I'll find that the modern Christians are much more amenable to the concept. Maybe conceptually speaking, like they're more willing to talk with people in the dark blue about the idea. Hey, let's put God on trial. There are a decent number of groups that I've been involved with over the years that have had that kind of theme. Hey, let's put God on trial. Let's have a mock trial. You know, let's present our arguments. You be the defense. I'll be the prosecutor. Blah, blah, blah. We go and have our discourse and our discussion around that. The textual God versus the actual God. We're going to get into that in just a moment here with Copan. But that's a really important distinction between the light blue and the red in my mind, in my thinking. And that is this: there's a lot of question amongst people in the light blue that's not present for people in the conservative, in the red area. And that is the role of the scriptures. And I think that there are a good number of modern Christians who are post-biblical. Now, I don't know that that necessarily means that they hate the Bible or that they completely reject it. But I think we'll see that it's not their primary source for religion about God. I think we'll see that there's an embracing of some of these modern ideas of critical inquiry for good or ill. I think there's also a strong emphasis on the primacy of human freedom. So where the conservatives in the red are perhaps harping on about God's freedom, I think we see the shoe on the other foot for folks in the light blue. Freedom of the human will, the autonomy, the independence of it. And here, Jesus Christ is often portrayed as the great servant of humankind. And you can see this. He makes salvation available. Versus in the red group, the conservative Christians would more often talk about he makes salvation happen for a particular group. So a particular atonement, a definite redemption, a limited atonement. But here I think in the light blue, we'll see a lot more of thoughts that, no, God has done something in service of humankind. And additionally, there's a sense, an ethos, a spirit that the pre-moderns, the folks in the red, are probably out of date in their Christianity. And the folks in the light blue probably think they have something better than the old pre-modern understandings of orthodoxy. We've seen this in some of our other inquiries and discussions, and in general, there's sort of a dialectic step around the time of the Enlightenment in the West. There's an upgrade, and I jokingly, pretend here that Christianity is like a software package. The moderns perhaps have gone to, in their minds, Christianity 2.0. With Christianity 1.0, that old conservative thing, is largely deprecated, not supported, not in good use anymore. We just know too much now. And did we mention that we have science? And in particular, they've upgraded their components to philosophy 2.0 and removed the old theology 1.0. Now that's a humorous way, perhaps, to talk about it. But the idea is that these three different groups, most likely the people in the red group are not even going to participate in the trial, thinking that it's a category error. The people in the dark blue are probably going to vote to convict. And people in the light blue, well, perhaps it's not so clear. So with that in mind, I think we're about ready to get into the text of Copan. But before we do that, let me just throw it over to you, Benjamin and Joshua, just to check in on these three categories. Is this even barking up the right tree? Are there other sorts of dimensions that you think might also be important here to bring out as we start to do that? Or what are your thoughts?
Well, this is really interesting, JC. I think that, if I had to define it, I would kind of define, I think I have a slightly different definition of conservative and liberal. But, I definitely see where you're going with this. And I think that there definitely is a tendency to prioritize just explaining things rather than relying on the primacy of the scriptures. And I think that a lot of that happens. I think you make a lot of great points about this stuff. As far as theology or theologically, I guess I would define the conservatism more along the lines of, at the risk of sounding like a Finneyite, I would kind of define it more along the lines of like moral transformation and the resurrection and the textual authority of the Bible. So this seems like this is an interesting view that you have here, because it's like you're looking at some other angle than I typically look at. And I'm not discrediting the view. I'm just saying this isn't usually how I think in the structure. So I think I have to just say that it's very interesting. I think there's some good points, and I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about what you're saying here. I'm just taking this in and just pondering it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you, my friend, for that feedback. Joshua, let me throw you in the deep waters here.
Yes, sorry. I didn't realize if that was it, or you're going to add another.
Yes, that was the push.
Okay.
I'm pushing you into the deep water.
Fair enough. I would say that I think this is an interesting layout. I find it interesting in the distinction between those of the red, let's say the blue versus the dark blue, the light blue versus the dark blue. And I can appreciate the sort of almost Venn diagram-esque approach where the light blue kind of overlaps some with the dark blue, in that they both are appealing to things like human reason, let's call it that. And I think that those that are in the red, who might deign to not partake in the trial, let's say, because they would say this particular trial is not even worth having, that's not necessarily a bad position to take for that person. I just don't think at that level that they're going to be able to engage very well with someone who is in the dark blue, let's say. Excuse me. And that the issue with that is that you'll have a point where the person in the dark blue is going to say, well, look at all these horrible things that I'm, convicting God of, right? As you pointed out. And that person will say, these are all terrible, horrible things. And someone in the red category might say, what's your point? Like, this discussion's not even necessarily worth having. God's right. And that's that. And the person in the blue would then probably try to say something to the effect of, oh, well, you're just, you must be out of your mind. You don't even, you're just appealing to this authority and not even, thinking for yourself at all. And that's where I think the people in the light blue might really be of help, because they'll be in a point where, I think you rightly pointed out, they will be more likely to actually engage. They will say, no, God is not guilty of this particular thing of which you're accusing him, and let's reason and weigh the evidence. And on that level, I think they're very effective, because they can engage with someone who is in the dark blue on some level, because they share some of that reason. I think also that there are some individuals who might blur the lines a little bit between the light blue and the red, where they may accept a lot of the things in the red, but they do so with the reason and the logic and all that all in one. And I think I might find myself in that category, because I do agree with pretty much everything that the red is saying, as best as I can understand it. And I, the blue, I don't necessarily disagree with these points, but I think I would be of the opinion that the logic and reason point to the points of the red, if that makes sense. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this goes forward when we delve more into the topic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And that's a that's a beautiful insight, by the way. In fact, the way you just described yourself is the feeling I get for Paul Copan as the author of this book. So there are he articulates strong points from the red. And at the same point in time, I think there are also ways in which he's part of the light blue. So that's completely fair. So these categories are not necessarily hard and fast, but they're just meant to sort of get us into the discussion, because we're going to have very different reactions to some of the things that are said here. And now finally, we're in Copan's text. It took us long enough, and that's all on me. But I love this opening here for Copan in chapter 1. Now, Copan talks about the idea that in assessing, is God a vindictive bully? There are critics from outside looking in to Christianity, and there are also critics within Christianity who are making interesting statements that I think are important parts of this discussion. Now, two of our opening comments here are very much a part of the dark blue crowd. So Copan cites A.A. Milne, the author of Winnie the Pooh, as saying the Old Testament is responsible for more atheism, agnosticism, disbelief, call it what you will, than any book ever written. And of course, we've got Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, a pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. And Dawkins advises parents not to use the Old Testament to teach morals to the children. This is, of course, a very strong statement for people who I would throw in this dark blue category. Joshua, in your own thinking, what has happened in society in, let's say, the last 50 years that perhaps has led to such an increase in the number of these very strident opposing statements as opposed to, of course, prior to that?
Well, I would say honestly that it really depends on how to phrase this. It's really like the person who's sitting on the branch of a tree cutting off the limb on which they're sitting, because the major difference that's happened, and this is specifically in the West, and by the West, of course, I mean, you know, like the United States, a lot of Europe, you know, countries that traditionally have been founded on Christian principles. Excuse me. And what ends up happening, or what has happened, is that society has progressed based on those doctrines and those ideas, and has improved significantly. I think we would agree that over the last, even, you know, several hundred years, even if we say the last 500 years, ever since the Protestant Reformation, when, you know, things like the Bible being translated so that the common person can read it and understand it, and you know, apply it to themselves, that those things ended up leading to the modern society, where everybody likes the positives and the tolerance and the love and the care and so on and so forth. And that is so fully ingrained in us that we take it for granted instead of realizing where it came from. It's very unique. Not to say that other cultures are unloving, but the idea that a person should be respected even if they're our enemy, that is decidedly a Christian view, or at least Judeo-Christian, because I know in the Old Testament it mentions it too. But the fact is that people today, they question the foundation on which their beliefs are really rooted, even if it isn't rooted in a knowing sense, but the way that the culture was formed was basically through those principles. And so it really is a situation where they understand that we should love one another. They understand all the positive things of those which our culture has adopted, if you will. But then they turn that particular set of morals and try to examine the Old Testament and the you know, the more wrathful side of God, which they then, in some way, they seem to say that, you know, oh, this is somehow contradictory. um and so in that way, that's where a lot of people really adopt that, is that they're fooled by that kind of an argument, because I don't think they've really delved into it. They think that, you know, the God of the Old Testament is this wrathful, hateful, terrible being, as Richard Dawkins, you know, threw pretty much every bigoted insult in the book at him. But they don't understand that in the book, or in the Bible, I should say, there's explanations for this. There's reasons for why these things are the way they are. And it's not as if God is just some, you know, he just came out of nowhere and is punishing these people. These individuals were not great individuals. In fact, God constantly is talking about how these people they're murderers, they're liars, they have, you know, they do things like sacrifice their children. There's all sorts of horrible, awful stuff, and God is basically saying that he's using the people of Israel a lot of times to bring judgment upon these individual, you know, these societies that need to be, you know, their time has come, and God has decided that that is their time, and that's the way that it's going to happen. So I think a lot of the modern individuals, especially the new atheists, have their sensibilities, um I don't want to say hurt, but it almost, they see what they appear, what they think, they see an illusion of a contradiction, and rather than pursuing it and exploring the idea, they then just dismiss it as if this is this horrible thing, and therefore it should be rejected, which is ironic, because again, the very culture on which they stand is built on those principles, uh, and that's basically what I think is going on in the modern culture.
Great points. Great points. Benjamin, there really is, at least in the way Dawkins has framed it, there's no reconciliation possible, short of, you know, if Dawkins' assertions and evaluations are correct, then the only conclusion is Dawkins' conclusion. Now it all comes back to, is Dawkins correct? And this is where the discussions get intense. And we've seen the accusations. God's a moral monster. Why? Well, God permits slavery and regulates it in the Old Testament. God commands that things be done that would today be called genocidal. And, God chooses winners and losers in the game of life, as it were, as he has a chosen people, and then he has a people who he's rejected. And so these external critics really have a place to stand on in terms of having specifics. Now, I just want to, Benjamin, bring up one particular example. Now, of course, I have to be careful. I don't agree with Dawkins' positions, but I think I can see why he would have the position that he would have, even though I don't agree with it. Here's one of my quote-unquote favorite passages. And I'll explain what I mean by that. This is Numbers chapter 15. While the Israelites, this is right after the Exodus from Egypt. While the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Now, God had given an order for people to not work on the Sabbath. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly. They arrested him and they kept him in custody. They put him in jail. This is the vernacular we would use today. It's not clear what should be done to him. And then right here, then the Lord said to Moses, this man must die. So the assembly took him outside the camp, stoned him to death, as the Lord commanded Moses. I said this is one of my favorite passages and chapters, not because I take any particular glee or joy in the fate that came to the man, but simply to say to those who are going to base their Christianity on the Bible, behold, your God. I see a lot of apologizing and, well, this wasn't really quite that, and this didn't really mean that, and a lot of situations where people perhaps seek to minimize some of the things that happened and that were ascribed to God himself. But here we have it. Here we have it. God condemning a man to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. And you can hear it. You can hear the accusation from the folks in the dark blue category. How dare God do that? My response as a conservative Christian is, oh, he dare. And it's the fact that he does dare that makes him the God to be feared and to be faced, not as a moral monster, but definitely as a governor. And so, Benjamin, this is, the sort of goody two-shoes God, the cartoonish God who brings Christmas presents at Christmas time and stays out of your business the rest of the year. That God that's so appealing to so many modern people is not this God. And there are implications for that in our theology, implications that are unacceptable to so many people today. What do you think about situations like this, and how stark of a picture in your own mind does this present? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry,
You're muted.
I had somehow muted my microphone. Well, and so interestingly enough, this really isn't that hard for me personally to accept, because my father, who was a minister for over 40 years, always taught me basically that it's not our position to judge God. It's our position to believe God, to believe what He says and what He does is right. Um, However, I would say that I don't think that that excludes logic and reason from the process. I think that we can start off with concluding that whatever this is, that this means that God was right. And I think then that we can pray about it, pray for revelation. And furthermore, we can use our faculties of logic and reason to try to make sure that our interpretation is not just us, um, you know, relying on ourselves. And I think, though, that at the end of the day, that we have to come to the conclusion that in this passage that God said to put a man to death for picking up sticks, and you could contextualize it and explain it away in a lot of different ways, but that is what he did. And I would stand by the idea that this was correct. This was the correct thing to do. And the way that I can conclude it was the correct thing to do is because it says that God said it was. So I have to think that, I have to start with that assumption that it's correct because God said it. And then using my faculties of logic and reason, I'm going to check it and make sure that this is indeed what God really said. Does this make sense that He said this? I conclude that He did indeed say it. And then from there, I would use my faculties of logic and reason to try to construct a reasonable explanation for why God would do this. I already believe it. I already take it at face value. So my conclusion is that that this would have set an extremely bad precedent for the rest of the community, for God to, as king over the Israelites, to speak a word and a commandment one day prior, and then somebody flagrantly disobeys it and He just lets them off the hook. And I would furthermore say that it would take a particularly brazen sort of person to completely disregard the words of some flaming celestial being, some flaming divine being, and just go out and just completely just overlook it. So my conclusion is that it must be that he did deserve to be put to death and that it was righteous. But on the surface, to a 21st century mind, it looks like it's just stupid. Looks like, man, this guy picked some sticks up and you killed him. Like, I think there's a lot more to it than that. And I would say that I think it could work from the other direction too, where the person could use logic and reason to conclude that this was even if this was a military commander or a king or whatever, this scenario could arise where like the king commands something and somebody just immediately flagrantly breaks it and they put him to death. Because if the king doesn't put him to death, then his power is basically, it's basically nullified. I think you could go from both directions. Me personally, I find it easier to just assume that God was right. I think starting with a 21st century framework, it may be difficult for a lot of people to use logic and reason to conclude that a man should have been executed for picking some sticks up. But I think it could be done with the right approach. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. And one of the one of the things too that I would say in my own response is I'm not sure that people always realize how easily we can take our subjective evaluations and project them into timeless values. Does God have the right? He's going to ask in the scriptures later. Does God have the right to do with His creation as He pleases? And He's going to say yes. Now, Joshua, I'm going to share another favorite, in air quotes, favorite passage from Numbers chapter 16. Again, not that I take glory or joy in this passage, but it's there and it's in the text. And for the millions of biblically illiterate Christians who have never read this, it's time to read it. So basically, you have Dathan and Abiram. They're challenging Moses' political authority. They've come up out of Egypt, and Moses is issuing orders like he runs the place. And Dathan and Abiram are saying, in democratic fashion, if I might, whoa, 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 Moses, old man, who made you our leader? And so after a lot of political intrigue, Moses decides to ask God for a referendum on his leadership. And so in this chapter, it says this: they've separated Dathan and Abiram and their households from the rest of the Israelites. And then Moses says this: how are you going to know if I should be your leader, I, Moses, should be your leader, or if Dathan and Abiram should be your leader? How are you going to know? And here's what Moses says. Then Moses said, this is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things, and that it, the political leadership of Israel, was not my idea. If these men die a natural death and suffer the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them with everything that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the realm of the dead, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt. Now Joshua, as soon as Moses finished saying this, the ground under Dathan and Abiram split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households, and all those associated with Korah, together with their possessions. They went down alive into the realm of the dead with everything they owned. The earth closed over them, and they perished and were gone from the community. Joshua, what do you think about this related story?
Well, I would say that I would kind of echo a lot of things that Benjamin said earlier in these situations. You know, if God is all powerful, if God is all good and God is all righteous, and you start from those principles, then the obvious solution to the problem is God had justification for why he did what he did. We may not necessarily know that justification, because this is the other thing. There's a lot of stuff that is in the Old Testament that the Old Testament writers captured what was important, but I believe they left a lot of context out of the situation of what exactly was going on and who was doing what and who was where and all this other stuff. And what I mean by that is that the idea is in the minutia, and God knows the minutia. So he knew all of these individuals that were in their situation, and he knew everything about what they were doing and how it was wrong and how it was transgressed and so on and so forth. And on top of that, he has the authority to pronounce judgment on those individuals. So, and what I mean by that is all of us have sinned. And this may not be a popular opinion, but since all of us have sinned, and all of us, you know, have technically earned, shall we say, the wages of death, God reserves the right to call upon that as he sees fits. Now, I don't think God just goes around wholesale slaughtering people for no reason, and that's what I'm trying to, you know, that's clearly, I don't think that's in line with God, because, you know, there are other parts of the Old Testament where I think of Jonah is a great example, where, you know, he sends Jonah to the city of Nineveh, and he says, "You tell those people of Nineveh that I'm going to destroy their city because they're so wicked and evil and corrupt." And of course, Jonah goes to the city, and he does. He tells them all these things about that, and the people of the city and the king and all of them are so shocked by this revelation that they repent. They straight up repent. They end up in a state of mourning. They cry out for, you know, basically forgiveness. I think the king sat in ashes and put on sackcloth, and of course Jonah is sitting there going, "Okay, I'm ready for this city to be destroyed now, you know, that everything was supposed to happen the way that, you know, God said it would." And all of a sudden, Jonah's like, "Wait, why didn't this city get destroyed?" And God's like, "They repented. They humbled themselves before me. And because they did that, I will have mercy on them." And the thing is that that's the same God in this situation. It's not a different God. It's the exact same God. That's what a lot of people don't understand, is the New Testament God and the Old Testament God are the exact same. So in this situation, I think it's reasonable to conclude that these individuals were not repentant. They were not in any way having the right heart or the right mindset. They were so full in their own ways that when God decided to pronounce the judgment in the way that he did, it was just. And I think that a lot of individuals should, a lot of people who are Christian, who believe in God and who believe the Bible, should take the Bible as a whole. And I'm not saying that you have to make excuses for God, because you don't. But I am saying that a lot of this stuff that goes on, if we know that God is the one that's in control, and if we know he is righteous, then we know that his decisions are also righteous. And to the other side that would try to use the logical and reasonable approach of saying, "Well, look how terrible he is. Look how horrible he is." To them, I would have to say, you're making a claim there. You're making a positive claim saying that this situation is horrible and this situation is wrong. You now bear the burden of proof on that. Can you demonstrate that there is no sufficient reason that God could have had to allow or cause these particular things to happen? And I have yet to hear any good response to that argument, other than basically some sort of self-derived mode of ethics. And then you can simply say, well, you're just a human. And if you're just a human, your knowledge and your understanding, as compared to a supreme being who's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent, and completely good and 100% righteous, your understanding is nothing compared to his. And so it's, you know, you can't use your own set of morals on their own to even levy any kind of argument against God. You need something else. You have to appeal to some sort of objective mode. And the only one that they really are able to use is something to the effect of, well, you know, Jesus said, you know, love your neighbor as yourself, and be tolerant, and so on and so forth. And that's true. But then you have to say, okay, so you're implying that there's an inconsistency with this. Okay, please demonstrate the inconsistency. And then that's usually where the argument will fall apart. And I think it's this very superficial, on its face approach to try to say, oh, well, this is clearly inconsistent. But if you really ponder it and think about it, I think that inconsistency just evaporates in a puff of logic.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. Now, one more passage, and then we will get back into Copan's text. In the midst of his suffering, Job has this to say, and we've read this previously from Job chapter 23. He says, I am so terrified in God's presence. When I think of it, terror grips me. God has made me sick at heart. The Almighty has terrified me. Now, friends, that's a man in the middle of a devastating situation. But it is a man with insight. Why is that? Well, it is because absent a healthy respect from God, humankind will lose a wholesome and true religion. It says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And who can fear him? In some sense here, it is this idea of this reverent recognition of the true terror of who God is in relationship to the sinful human being. It's this recognition that seems to cause one of two reactions. One reaction is, I hate this God. I will not be reconciled to him. And the other reaction is, I love this God. I will run to him and beg and plead for mercy. The same Job, who says, I am terrified in God's presence, says, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. And that is a big deal. Now, there is a movement in Christian circles that Copan's going to bring out that's maybe going to take a wildly different approach. And we're going to get close to this light blue position, perhaps, with these critics from within. Copan says this: the Old Testament's portrayal of God has critics from within the Christian community as well. And then he names and lists some of them. They would largely agree, Copan says, with Dawkins' description of the God of the Old Testament as genocidal, vindictive, and so on. But on the other hand, these critics from within don't think the true God is like this. In their mind, the portrayal of the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, as Dawkins says, is not the actual God, but is instead the textual God. So what's the difference between the actual God and the textual God? Well, in the minds of this group of Christians, this is a literary depiction of God by fallen, violence-prone, culturally conditioned, ancient Near Eastern biblical narrators or prophets. That is, the textual God is just a fictitious and flawed representation. And we can see here, you see this chart, trying to see if I can get this chart to look a little better. Okay. So we have, in terms of the modern light blue Christian contingent, some folks who will say, We're not with that God. And you can start to see why I categorize these modern movements as post-biblical, post-scriptural, as moving away from Christianity 1.0 to this Christianity 2.0, which is based on more human-centered ethics, ethics that are more in line with the folks in the dark blue, with their ideas of human flourishing, maximizing perfection. If I could possibly, I don't mean to be crass about this, but perhaps the modern Christian is idealized in this cartoonish fashion as Ned Flanders is in The Simpsons. He's the positive, Mr. Rogers-based, happy-go-lucky neighbor with a banana smile and a happy grin for you, and not too many moral demands. But while Dawkins' attack is direct and to the point, in some sense, that's a virtue. Not in holding that position, of course, I don't think, but with respect to the fact that Dawkins is very direct with his thesis. That's something that we can talk to as conservatives. But I think when we're in this position where we're talking with people who wish to reclaim Christianity from the God of the Old Testament, this can really be a sticky wicket. So, Benjamin, I'm just going to throw this out to you. We've got this actual God of modern liberalism. He's nonviolent. He's enemy-loving. He's forgiving. He's a lot like Jesus on the cross. And he's totally different from that textual God of the Bible, the one who came up through all those rough situations, doing horrible things to people in time and space. What do you make of these new Christian movements? And what do we think of their analysis?
Well, any liberal Christian movement that holds to that kind of an idea is basically degenerating into Gnosticism, because that's what Gnosticism really is it's a depiction of the Old Testament God as evil and the New Testament God as the real God of light that, you know, reveals the darkness of the creator of matter. And I think that this is certainly the demonic spirit or the demonic delusion that's behind all liberalization of Christianity. It's the spirit of Gnosticism. Whereas I think that the spirit of ultra conservatism or hyper conservatism or something, some kind of word like that, actually manifests into Islam, where it's so conservative that it wants to retain the Old Testament, and then the liberal, the ultra liberal form of Christianity wants to throw away the Old Testament. And I think you need a right balance of the both. You need to understand, like Josh was saying, that it's the same God in both testaments, and that this seemingly horrible stuff. I mean, the bottom line is that the Bible is supposed to raise us to the level of its depicted morality. We are not supposed to evaluate what the Bible's morality is. I mean, for example, here's a couple of insane, seemingly to the modern mind. One is Lot's two daughters go in and basically get impregnated by their father in order to raise up seed to their father. Okay, to us in the modern world, and even to them at that time, that was a shocking atrocity. But the scripture seems to be approving of it, because apparently their motivation in doing this was the correct motivation. There's sections in the law for how to handle a slave, how to handle having more than one wife. There's sections in the law for lots of things that we consider not only gray areas, but taboo or forbidden now. And apparently God was okay with them doing these things, or approved of it, or whatever. So we have to examine our sense of morality and our moral compass and say, am I imposing my cultural norms on top of the Bible? Am I imposing what I think is true on top of the Bible, or am I letting it speak to me? And I think that there's a lot of tough things in the Bible. Is God a vindictive bully? Well, it says that he's a vengeful God. That he's like, hey, vengeance belongs to him, and that's just the way it is. And I think so. There is a limit I think that using a logical, reasonable approach can explain a lot of things. However, I do think it's very difficult for somebody in the 21st century to use their ethical lens to examine the Bible. I mean, for example, here's one actually worse than all the previous ones, according to the 21st century people, is the idea that God commanded that, put a city to the sword and like destroy the whole city and everybody in it and all this stuff, all the men, women, children, the donkeys, and everything. And, we can use logic and reason to evaluate that, such as, it was actually impractical to leave survivors behind because there was no support system for survivors. And furthermore, um, you know, um, they were just going to starve to death. I mean, you couldn't just take in oceans of refugees into these ancient cultures and stuff. So, I mean, there was a practical reason for it, but I mean, I'm not sure the reason wasn't that God was just displeased. So, how do you come to these things? I don't know. I like I said, my father just kind of taught me to embrace this fearful side of God as being righteous, and that it's scary, but once you get used to it, it's really not that scary, in the sense that you have some theophobia or something, but it's like, it lends an air of gravity to it. Gravitas, I think, is the word. And it makes you take it seriously. It makes you take the whole thing seriously. And at the end of the day, you can go through and you can explain, you can come up with apologetics for why it is. But at the end of the day, you do kind of have to just accept that God is the ultimate form of morality. I mean, if God tells somebody to stand on their head and then smites them for not doing it, then it's like, he was right. I'm not sure how that works, but he was correct. It's kind of like in the New Testament, or in I think it's the Kings, where the prophet tells the man that's standing next to him, well, I mean, it's a commandment in the Bible, touch not my anointed and do my prophets no harm. Yet God led a prophet to speak to another man and said, punch me, strike me so that I'm wounded. And the man said, no, I won't do it, basically, because you're a prophet. And it says God smote the man for not striking the prophet. So it's kind of like, yeah, there can be an apologetic for that, and you could say, well, that was a case by case basis, and the other thing was a general rule. But I mean, at the end of the day, I just have to conclude that the guy wasn't in tune enough with God to follow the commandment of the Lord. I think that you have to be led by the Spirit and not have a hardened heart. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, so I'm going to chop myself off. But just to close the thought, is that you can't judge God by his own moral rules, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, yeah, God has certain like stringent moral rules that he has dictated, but I mean, at the same time, it's like, what about the incident with what about Abraham? You're not supposed to marry your sister. Abraham was married to his sister, and then God himself showed God himself, well, no, that's a different story. Never mind, I'll let that one go. I don't know. There's exceptions, and I'm not saying there's exceptions to every rule. Some rules are pretty hard line. There's never going to be an exception. But I mean, it's like when he said, "Don't pick up sticks on the Sabbath," and he said, "Put anybody to death." Meanwhile, the priests and the Levites were all profaning the Sabbath every single Sabbath with all their sacrifices and doing all that work and all that stuff like that. And Jesus pointed that out. It says in the law not to eat the showbread that's dedicated for the priests, and yet David asked Ahimelech, the high priest, asked him to give him the showbread from the Lord's altar, and he did it. And it's like, why? I don't know. It's like the famous Supreme Court justice said. He said the old man knows, or the young man knows the rules, but the old man knows the exceptions. I guess God just knows the exceptions, and He knows what to do. And I think that in those difficult cases, it's probably not impossible for logic and reason to solve those cases or to present an explanation. However, I think it is difficult or challenging because we have a built-in moral ethos of our culture and society that we're going to kind of be like filtering our logic and reason through. So, that's my 2 cents. Sorry.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. There's no doubt about it, I think. The reader has to, in assessing Christianity, the reader has to understand what the scriptures say and what the scriptures don't say. And the people in the dark blue would be very foolish to make charges if there wasn't some sort of prima facie case to be made. Now, all I mean by that, and all I'm saying is that people who have problems with the way God rules his universe have problems. The question is, are we in the right position to evaluate and judge and render a moral opinion on God's actions? Now, the idea that Copan brings up is that many modern Christians have gone to the next step. And that next step is, as we mentioned, to divorce the Christian God, the actual God, the God of love, from the textual God. And there's some talk and idea here that this is the critics claim that the Old Testament prophets were simply wrong in much of what they did and said and wrote about, and this was an inevitable aspect of the baggage of their ancient Near Eastern worldview. Now, Copan's answer, he says this: severity is a description not just of the textual God, but of the actual God. His answer, his squaring of the circle is, that doesn't mean, though, that severity or wrath is central to the triune God's nature. As we'll see, Copan says, love is God's central attribute, and God's severity flows out of his love. Now, Copan clarifies, God desires the ultimate well-being of humans, but he will sometimes have to say, enough is enough. He will have to act in judgment to stop dehumanization and other evils that undermine human flourishing. And now, did you hear that? Joshua, did you hear that? Copan, who started off, in my mind, almost perhaps in the red category, the conservative category. He's now over here making arguments that interact with the goal of human flourishing that is such a part of those in the dark blue. And that's why I say, you know, Joshua, you were quite right to point out that these are not hard and fast categories, that some people might hold to some ideas in the red while still being in the light blue. And some people might hold to some ideas in the light blue while still being in the dark blue. And the picture gets complicated. How do you start to square this circle? How do you answer the critic who says, I don't approve of your God?
Well, there's a really good quote by C.S. Lewis, and I believe it goes something like, the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation. And it's in that, I think, that it really gets the whole story. In that, in every action that God does, at least especially what's seen in the Bible, and I think it's honestly a real life experience for many Christians as well, that even though there might be a time where things are bad and things are rough, and it seems like there's almost no hope, if you will, in those situations, that is a means that God uses to draw us closer to him. Because all throughout the Old Testament, you know, talking about the children of Israel and their actions, their decisions, their turning away from God, and then him dealing with them, he lays it out in the law where he says something to the effect of, if you keep my commandments and you keep focusing on me the way that you ought, things are going to go good. But as soon as you turn away from that, as soon as you stop obeying this law, as soon as you engage in sinful activity and you become corrupt, then these awful things are going to happen to you. And it even stresses, if you continue to do these things, then more bad things will happen to you, more tragedy, not necessarily evil, but more bad things will happen to you. And it keeps building it, and there's it's this idea of every time that you keep and persist in this, these awful things are going to happen to you until you realize that I'm the one that you need, and you have messed up, and you should be asking for forgiveness. And in fact, that happens over and over and over and over and over again until finally in the book of Isaiah, they've done this time and time again, and they've sacrificed and they've asked for forgiveness. But now it mentions in that book that God's basically tired of their half-hearted attempts, because now they don't even mean it. They're, everything is all just for show. And God at that point is like, okay, well, this is pointless and this is worthless to me now, because the whole point was that you had your heart in it, because that's what God really values. And so I would say this to the person that would question God in terms of, why does he allow these bad things to happen, or why did he cause these bad things to happen? Why did he say to the Israelites to wipe out this city? Why did he, even modern day, let's say, there's tragedies that occur today, and God, he's all powerful, right? Well, why did he allow for those things to happen? He could have just snapped his fingers and it wouldn't have happened. Why would he allow those horrible things? And to that, I would say that everything that God has done and everything that God will do is exactly what's mentioned in this book. He will have to act in judgment to stop dehumanization and other evils that undermine human flourishing. That in some ways that we may not even understand today, And in some ways that might even be akin to, like, the butterfly effect, where a small effect here or even a large effect over here is going to echo and have huge ramifications throughout the future. That it's going to bring about the greatest good. And so I think it's Romans 8:28. All things work together for the good of them that love God. And that right there is the whole story, is that we just see this one act in a vacuum by itself. We don't understand, or we don't have the wisdom necessarily to see what it's going to bring about in the future. There's so many different variations. You would essentially have to be God to be able to understand how, the threads are all weaved together and what exactly is going to lead to what and how all of it's going to branch out. And so it really boils down to a situation where you have a person who is trying to impose their own ethical principles on a system they know nothing about. A classic example in philosophy and ethics is known as the trolley problem. And I'm sure many of our listeners have heard the classic problem. You have a trolley coming down a rail, and it splits, and on one side you have X number of people tied to the rail, and on the other side you have a single person or some variation of that. And what do? Do you pull the lever and switch the track to kill this group of people, or do you pull the lever and switch the track to kill that one person? Now obviously that's very reductive, but the solution would be something along this line, is that the reason why it's such a trying problem for us is because, one, it challenges our own ethical principles that we hold so dear, and that we a lot of times vauntingly say is the paragon of right and wrong, which it's not. And two, the other issue is that we deal with imperfect knowledge. We don't have the information to say what's going to happen exactly as the results of each of those. So we have no way of knowing for certain which choice would actually be the right one in that given situation. Now, again, like I said, that's reductive, but it's a thought experiment. It's about the idea of what's going on. And that, to me, is the exact answer, is that when you have a being like God who can understand and see everything and every action and how it's going to affect things and what's going to be the best possible thing in that situation, I think God is able to enact that with such clarity that we don't. And as such, we then lose the right, or at least even the ability, really, to reasonably criticize God. And therein lies the point, is that all the rationality, all the logic, and so on and so forth, if we're being honest within the context of the situation, it ultimately does not work. And so logic and reason actually become enemies of the individuals that are in the blue, because they end up having this insurmountable situation where they would essentially have to become God and see all the possibilities and all the outcomes in a way that they just can't. It's such a heavy burden of proof to bear. Only God can. And so again, they don't have the ability to reasonably question it at that point. They can still question it. They can still feel emotionally some type of way about it. And that's a whole nother issue altogether. But then I would point out to that individual that they're no longer using reason and logic. And so now they've gone beyond the means of their own argumentation. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Joshua, I love that. Copan gives us his answer as well. And he has an answer for these two different groups. Now, in the blue section on the left, he says this: in light of the dual biblical affirmation of both God's kindness and God's severity, for our critics from without, and here Copan is referring to the people we've put into the dark blue category. So for the folks in the dark blue, Copan says this: we want to emphasize that God is far more loving, kind, patient, tender, and merciful than we could ever know. Now, we've read some of those clobber passages, putting the guy to death for gathering sticks on the Sabbath, Lot and his daughters, Dathan and Abiram in their political rebellion. What we didn't have time to read is what Copan brings out here. Throughout the Old Testament, we also see language of God wooing people back to himself. We see a God who is hurt by their rebellious hearts, a God who longs to show mercy, a God who has a genuine desire to provide for the people, and a God who pleads. You know, in my distant days as a salesperson, by the way, not everybody knows this, but when I was young, I was the world's worst salesperson. Somebody actually asked me that one day when I was on the phone selling them something. They said, "Are you sure you are not the world's worst salesperson?" Because I was really bad. But one of the things they teach you in sales is never say please. When you're closing the sale, when you're trying to get the other person to buy, you don't say please. But what does God do all throughout the Old Testament? He pleads with people to return to him. Dozens and dozens of generations, thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people, God pleads with them. Turn from your wicked ways. Turn and be healed. Turn and be reconciled. And so what Copan says to people in the dark blue, God is far more loving, kind, patient, tender, and merciful than you are giving credit for. And then on the right side of the page, in front of us, is Copan's answer to critics in the light blue. He says this: for our critics from within, we emphasize that God is more severe and harsh and unsafe than they suggest. For those sinners who oppress, dehumanize, defraud, mislead, live hypocritically, divine wrath, and Benjamin and Joshua, both of you were saying this throughout the discussion, divine wrath is the appropriate and just response, just as it is to other objective moral evils. Benjamin Copan gives us a measured response to two of these three groups. What do you think of the way he phrases it? What do you think of this picture he paints to the one group who portrays God as a genocidal monster? He says, you are far too aggressively inauthentic with your criticism. And then to those who say, on the other side, God is a God of love and presence and fluffy pictures of bunnies hopping happily in the field, the green fields, with nothing but good things to think about in your theology. Copan says, your criticism is inauthentic. And so, what do you think of those two ideas? And how close are you to Copan with his analysis?
Well, I'd say that this is really pretty accurate in my opinion, because it's like Luther said, Martin Luther, he said that the law, the 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 law is supposed to terrify us and to put fear in us, and it's supposed to make us realize our insufficiency, and the law is supposed to show us that God is going to avenge his righteousness, and he's going to punish the evildoer. He's going to wipe iniquity clean off the earth. And yet on the other hand, we have the gospel, which is the good news. The good news that God has provided a ark of salvation, which is Christ. To draw the analogy, it was God that destroyed the earth with the flood, but it was God who saved Noah and his family in the ark. So, it's both God's divine justice on the wicked, but it's the grace or the good news. The good news is that there's a way to escape this terrible fate. And without the proper, I think I would say that until you have communicated the attributes of God in such a way, his love and mercy, contrasted with his wrath and justice, until you have communicated these in such a way that the casual observer thinks that you have schizophrenia, you probably aren't communicating it properly. In other words, the casual observer who hears you talking about these two things should probably think that you're crazy and that you're constantly contradicting yourself, because you'll talk about one and then the other and how they relate to one another. But that's just because their paradigm hasn't been caught up to God's understanding, where these things make perfect sense and they go together, and all the reasons and all the logic and everything just merges perfectly in his mind and in his way of doing things. I think this is good. If I would agree with this. I think this is correct. I'm done.
Joshua, how about for you, my friend?
I would be inclined to agree with that that dissertation that Benjamin gave. The reason I would say that is because this seeming contradiction, and I call it a seeming contradiction for a reason, because it isn't a contradiction. If anybody is doing logic and reason correctly, then they should understand that there's a difference between an argument which sounds convincing and an argument which actually is convincing. There are plenty of things that appear a certain way and yet aren't that way upon further scrutiny and further examination. In this way, I think that the Bible simultaneously says God is all loving, and the Bible simultaneously says that God is perfect. And in that word perfect, right, you have excuse me, there's another attribute I forgot to mention, that God is also perfectly righteous, that God is all righteous. And so in this term of perfection, his love is perfect and his righteousness is perfect. And since God knows everything, and since God is fully holy, fully righteous, then he necessarily has to ensure that whatever punishments that need to be meted out, whatever recompense that is paid to those who have transgressed, that must happen. It has to happen because he's perfect. He cannot allow for that to be undone for eternity. It's just not possible in his nature, because then he wouldn't be fully righteous and perfect. But on the same hand, his love is perfect in that, as Benjamin said, he has created a way for us to escape the judgment because he loves us, and he sacrificed his only son for that purpose, in such a huge turn of events that really should shock the foundations of everyone thinking about it. Because the God of the universe, the one who said, okay, all this corruption, all this sin, it's terrible, it's vile, it should not have, it's awful. All he's really wanted ultimately is your heart, and for you to love him and for you to obey him, because the obedience part is important. You know, it's not just that we get saved and, you know, it's great and Jesus loves us and then we can continue on sinning. No, that's not right. That's wrong. That's totally wrong. But it is definitely the case that in our horrible sinful state, God has created a way for us to be with him through his son. And ultimately, that is the largest act of love. And everything that happens in history, everything that's happening every day that God allows, I believe fully is engaged in bringing people closer to him and recognizing that he is the one that they need. And that if they would do that, that even though the road may seem hard, even though that there's a lot of tough and difficult things, like Benjamin pointed out, like Noah on the ark, God will save us and will keep us. And just like the rainbow that God put in the sky to promise that he would not destroy the earth again with the flood that way, he has promised us through his son Jesus Christ that he will not bring to bear the wrath on us that he has paid for us. And ultimately, it's this seemingly contradicting nature that if you deny either one, you're denying the perfect nature of God. And so really, for the individuals that don't really, they just don't like the, you know, the wrath of God, let's call it that, of the Old Testament, that ultimately they as they pointed out, if you deny that, you're ultimately denying the love of God as well, because now you're saying God cannot be perfect, and if he cannot be perfect, then his love can't be perfect either. God is he's an entity that you have to take in his fullness. You can't start cherry picking the attributes of God and you know, like you would a buffet. God is what he is, and if you read through the Bible and you understand as best as you can what's going on and what he's basically trying to say, I think that ultimately becomes clear.
Great point, my friend. Great point. I think I have a response to dear friends in the dark blue group. And then I have what I hope is a fair and representative Calvinist response to the accusation, because I see why people can make accusations that God is a monster and a bully. I don't think they pass, and I'm going to explain why. But I think something important is there, and we're going to talk about it. Now, this comes back to this Diogenization of critical methods and this cosmopolitanism. Now, Diogenes the Cynic is the subject of my referent here. So let me actually just pull him up real quickly. And this is my fear. This is my fear. Let me find our story about Diogenes. Okay, of course it's hiding. I should have had it. I'll have to put that in on another time. But Diogenes the Cynic. If you look at the tone of these accusations, there's sort of a bullying quality to the accusation that God is a bully. And you can sort of see that in videos like this. So here's a video from Dr. Frank Turek. We're not going to play the video, but in it is a famous exchange on the internet. And so this is Cody the atheist. And Cody the atheist is talking with Dr. Turek, and he's speaking in a strident, Diogenes-like tone. And here's what he says to Dr. Turek. Dr. Turek, why doesn't God stop the violation of women. Dr. Turek says what he has to say, and then Cody just repeats it again. Dr. Turek, why doesn't God stop this thing? Dr. Turek gives him an answer, and then Cody says it again. Dr. Turek, why doesn't God stop this thing? And then there's another video in this series, and it's the same kind of interchange. Dr. Turek is talking to this Diogenes figure, Cody, the atheist, and Cody says it again. He just repeats the same accusation. Dr. Turek, would you kill your family? Dr. Turek answers. Dr. Turek, would you kill your family? Dr. Turek gives an answer. Dr. Turek, would you kill your family? There's just this aggressiveness to Cody that I say it's refreshing. I, of course, don't mean that in the virtuous way. But it is refreshing in the sense that it's refreshing to have this straight up situation. And I am reminded when I hear Diogenes style critics in our contemporary present, like Cody, the atheist, I think of people in the dark blue. And I say to myself, this quote from Nietzsche is so pertinent. Where has God gone? Nietzsche writes of his madmen. I shall tell you, we have killed him. We are his murderers. How have we done this? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? Then it says this. That which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? With what water could we purify ourselves? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Now the madman speaks from a position of madness for somebody who's a Christian conservative like myself in the red group. In fact, the madman, Nietzsche's madman, speaks in sort of a clarion call, a call to rebel that is meant to echo to people with this cosmopolitan, secularized view throughout history. Take up your knives and start to the work of ending the gods in your lives that you encounter. He's fairly open about it. And to such people, my heart goes out to you. For there is a God, and he knows how to answer the knife wielders. Deuteronomy chapter 28 says this: if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully keep all his commands, the Lord your God will set you high above the nations of the world. You will experience all these blessings if you obey the Lord your God. And then it says your towns and fields will be blessed. Your children and your crops will be blessed. The offspring of your herds and flocks will be blessed. Your fruit baskets and breadboards will be blessed. Wherever you go and whatever you do, you will be blessed. The Lord will conquer your enemies when they attack you. They will attack you from one direction, but they will scatter from you in 7. Why? Because the Lord is on your side. The Lord will guarantee a blessing on everything you do, will fill your storehouses with grain. The Lord will bless you in the land he is giving you. If you obey the commands of the Lord your God and walk in his ways, the Lord will establish you as his holy people, as he swore he would do. Now, I could continue reading on in the blessings. Let me get to the next section. But if you refuse to listen to the Lord your God and do not obey all the commands and decrees I'm giving you today, all these curses will come and overwhelm you. Your towns and your fields will be cursed. Your fruit baskets and breadboards will be cursed. Your children and your crops will be cursed. The offspring of your herds and flocks will be cursed. Wherever you go and whatever you do, you will be cursed. The Lord himself will send on you curses, confusion, and frustration in everything that you do, until at last you are completely destroyed for doing evil and abandoning me. The Lord will afflict you with diseases. The Lord will strike you with wasting diseases. The disasters will pursue you until you die. The Lord will cause you to be defeated by your enemies, and on and on and on. Now, in one sense, I can hear some of my friends in the dark blue. You just admitted it. Your God is a moral monster. Your God is a vindictive bully. No, my friend. No. My God is the governor of this world. And you cross him at the peril of his justice. And you can make pictures all you like of Ned Flanders and smiling old men in clouds with white beards, handing out bonbons and Christmas gifts. You can do that all you want, my friend. But let me tell you, don't mess around with this governor. He knows how to handle rebels. That's different from being a moral monster. That's different from being a vindictive bully. Obey and be blessed, the scriptures say. Disobey and be cursed. Friends, Copan has really helped us go down an interesting journey. Let me throw it over to each one of you for some final thoughts.
I'd just like to say that, that's really what it does boil down to is that God is, he's just and he's good. And I think that, I often talk to people about this, and it always boggles people when I tell them this particular thing that I'm about to say. It always boggles them. And they always think, why didn't I think of this before? But, people say, why would a loving God send people to hell? Well, let me tell you something. Why would a loving person send God to hell? Okay. And you think about that statement, when have we ever done that? But they would do it. They would do it. And here's how I would argue is that sinners, the rebellious, the chicken, the chicken before the egg thing. Well, sin came first in this thing of judgment. God wasn't going around judging and smiting everybody before there was sin. But sin, when it was given the opportunity that the Son of God was in a mortal body, sin subjected the Son of God to the maximum possible suffering and pain that could be inflicted on him in that form. Yes, I know it was the justice of God, and he predetermined it and everything, but I'm saying it was sin that put Jesus on the cross. Sin is this thing that, if given the opportunity, does the most hurtful possible thing that it has available to do to God if it's unrestrained. And because of that, if people show up to the judgment day as God's enemies, somebody that would like to hurt God and did hurt God and would like to hurt the people that are with God, and they would like, Jesus said, "Do unto others as you have done unto you." Well, he's practices what he preaches. That tells me that the people who he puts into hell are going to be people who would have liked to have put him into hell, and that in effect their sin would like to have subjected God to as much suffering as it could. And I think that's something that people leave out when they're looking at the grand scheme of things. They don't see that it's not just this neutral environment where you're a sinner and you just don't believe and you're not accountable for anything. Is that, like, really ultimately at the end of the road, if you reject God, you're really saying that you hate him, and you're really saying that you would like to hurt him, like you'd like to injure him. And I would say the reason that I would prove that is that when he was here, they did do the maximum that they could. So it's not really just a theoretical what if, or I think it's like this. It's like they did it. Now, granted, they didn't have the tools or the means to do anything more to him than that, because there wasn't anything in this realm available to do more to him. But if they'd have had it, the devil would like to put God in hell. That's what he'd like to do. And so God just rewards him according. But at the end of the day, this severity in God's judgment corresponds to the severity of the wickedness. And the wickedness really is truly wicked. And these things that people want to do, these evil things, really are like, they would like to do these things to God. And so God defends himself, basically. He defends his righteousness, he defends his honor. And I think that whole narrative of, well, it's just an innocent person living his life, he shouldn't be held accountable for the fact that he just doesn't think this or that. It's like, that's not exactly the way it works. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. Thank you. Joshua, I think Paul Copan has given us something to think about. He's also given us something to ponder as we continue going through this book in its other chapters. I mean, there's more here, is the point. So in some sense, Joshua, we're not necessarily trying to solve every problem associated with these inquiries in just one discussion session, but we're rather instead trying to find general principles that we can stand on as we move through and discuss these issues in all their various dimensions. What are your final thoughts about these kinds of topics?
Well, I would say that these kind of topics are extremely interesting, and I think they're worth having. The discussions, rather, about these topics, definitely so, because it is definitely something which is cropping up that people they seem to have genuine questions about these things. Now, I'm not going to say that every person who ever, launched the idea of like, oh, God, is he really that good? Look at all the horrible stuff he's done. Like, they're not every person who's launched that argument, I think, did so in good faith. But I know that there definitely are people who genuinely struggle with this. There are even Christians who struggle with these ideas of suffering and when we find ourselves, we're going through some of the toughest times, we might, we question, we say, why should we have to do this? Why me? And someone might even say, God is supposed to be all loving. If he loved me so much, why would he put me through this? there's so many different angles that this goes through and comes from. And so I think it's very much worth having the discussions. And I think ultimately, when done comprehensively, the answer to the question, is God a vindictive bully, is a loud and resounding no. Because in many cases, where things are what they are, every act in a vacuum on its own is just an act, and it seems like it might be a horrible thing. But taken within the grand context and the understanding that God has, those things have their reasons and justifications. As Benjamin said, when we turn our back on God, we hurt him. We hurt his heart. We end up engaging in practices that are just ultimately wrong. And it is wrong. And God is the judge. God is the one who understands right from wrong on a level that we just don't. We can't. We can understand that it is wrong. And we may understand that, it does hurt God. But I think God has a level of an understanding of the whole situation that we just will never be able to quite get. We can understand that he does have that level of understanding, but understanding what all the fine details are, I think is an ongoing project that we have to go through life. And ultimately, the greatest comfort that I find in this whole thing is being able to trust in God and know that he has those answers while we might not. And that even though life may be a struggle, the ultimate truth is God is using us and all of the events for the greater good. And that when we stand before him and at the judgment, I believe he'll reveal all of that to us, and we'll understand fully and see the power and the authority and the love that he gave through all of it. And it will all be made manifest to us. And that's my final thought.
Amen, my friend. Amen. If it's all right with you all, I'll close this with a prayer.
Yeah.
Before I do that, just one brief word to people who've spent time watching this video. All of us on the panel wanted to present an intense position. We wanted to acknowledge the prima facie nature of the case against God, so to speak. The answer that we have, let me speak for myself in a personal fashion. There was something wholesome in Job's terror towards God. There was something true in realizing that God has that side of him. My advice is to run to him. It seems counterintuitive. Maybe from your evaluation, God is a bully, a monster. But the scriptures are a great comfort to me for the reasons that both Joshua and Ben have said. And so I want to encourage you. Pray to this God. Seek him. Submit to his governance. I think you will find there's great blessing in that. Let's pray. Lord God, we come before you in wonder and in awe. Lord God, when we properly consider you, then a holy and wholesome reverent fear comes to our hearts. It's a fear that encourages us to take notice of this situation. It's a fear that moves us to run towards you, seeking forgiveness, seeking reconciliation. Lord, thank you for my panel members. Thank you for them bringing out all of these points. Thank you for Brother Paul Copan and his text that allowed us to think very challenging thoughts about an intense issue. Lord, thank you for those people in the red group, in the light blue group, and even in the dark blue group, Lord. Let us speak among them as, as ambassadors of your goodwill. Lord, thank you for this time together, and be with us in the coming days, we pray, and ask this in the name of your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.